Welcome to this in-depth lecture on learning and inference in computer vision. Over the next 20 to 30 minutes we will build a complete picture of how probabilistic models let machines interpret images. Computer vision is not merely pattern matching on pixels, it is the science of recovering latent world state objects, shapes, motion, materials from noisy two-dimensional measurements captured by cameras. Whether you build classical pipelines or modern deep networks, the same modeling question appears again and again: should we learn the contingency of the world on the data, or the contingency of the data on the world? We use W for world state and D for observed data throughout. Data might be raw pixels, filtered features, depth maps, or video frames. World state might be a class label, a bounding box, a segmentation mask, a surface normal, or a full three-dimensional scene description. Learning means estimating model parameters from training examples. Inference means using the fitted model to predict world state on new data. This lecture follows a clear arc: define the vision problem, introduce discriminative and generative model families, work through regression and classification in detail, discuss how to choose between approaches, and finish with skin detection and background subtraction. By the end you should be able to read any vision paper and immediately identify whether the authors model P of W given D directly, or whether they specify a likelihood P of D given W plus a prior on W. You will understand why linear regression can arise both as a discriminative least squares fit and as the conditional mean of a generative Gaussian joint. You will see why logistic regression and naive Bayes can produce similar boundaries yet encode radically different assumptions. And you will know when generative background models still beat discriminative segmenters in deployed video systems. Section 1: Computer Vision Problems. Vision is fundamentally an inverse problem. The forward direction is physics in optics. Light leaves surfaces in a three-dimensional scene, travels through the atmosphere, passes through a lens, and lands on a sensor that records discrete pixel intensities. Inference runs backward along this chain. Given only the image, we must hypothesize what world configuration could have caused it. This inversion is ill-posed. Infinitely many three-dimensional scenes can project to the same photograph. Ambiguity from occlusion, lighting, textureless regions, and finite resolution means that uncertainty is intrinsic, not an afterthought. Vision tasks differ in what world variable W we want to recover. Image classification assigns a single label to the whole image: is this a cat or a dog? Object detection returns labels plus spatial extents, bounding boxes around each instance. Semantic segmentation assigns a class to every pixel, distinguishing road, sky, pedestrian, and vehicle regions. Dense reconstruction estimates depth or surface orientation per pixel, effectively inverting projection to recover three-dimensional structure. All of these are inference over W, but W lives in different spaces with different dimensionality and structure. A complete solution to any vision task requires three engineered components. First, a world representation, the variables we commit to estimating, discrete labels, continuous poses, binary masks, or parametric shape models. Second, a measurement model, how W generates D. This includes camera projection, reflectance and shading, motion blur, quantization, and sensor noise. Third, an inference algorithm, a procedure that searches or optimizes over candidate world states to find those consistent with the observation. That may be closed-form algebra, iterative optimization, sampling, dynamic programming, or gradient descent through a neural network. Learning enters when the measurement model or inference rule contains unknown parameters. From labeled pairs of images and annotations we estimate those parameters. From unlabeled images alone we may learn generative statistics of natural scenes. The split between learning and inference is conceptual. Learning happens offline on a training set, inference happens online on each new test image. A deployed vision system caches learned parameters, then runs inference repeatedly at test time. The modeling choice we explore next, discriminative versus generative, determines which distributions we fit during learning. Section 2: Types of Model. The central modeling fork is which probability distribution to learn. Discriminative models target the contingency of the world on the data P of W given D, or equivalently a direct function W hat equals F of D. They never attempt to model how images are formed. Instead, they learn the mapping or decision rule that best predicts labels or continuous targets from features. In classification, this is the posterior over labels. In regression, it is the conditional mean or median of the target given inputs. Discriminative training typically maximizes conditional likelihood, find parameters that make the observed labels as probable as possible given inputs. For regression, this reduces to minimizing squared error. For classification, it becomes cross-entropy loss. Support vector machines, random forests, and convolutional neural networks are all discriminative at their core. They learn boundaries or regressors without building a model of P of D. The key advantage is statistical efficiency for prediction. All model capacity focuses on the decision surface, not on irrelevant pixel variations. Generative models reverse the causal arrow. They model the contingency of data on the world, the likelihood P of D given W, combined with a prior P of W. Inference applies Bayes' theorem. The posterior P of W given D is proportional to the likelihood times the prior. The normalizing evidence P of D ensures probabilities sum to 1. Generative models answer counterfactual questions. What would an image look like if this object were present? They support simulation, data augmentation, and principled handling of missing data. Any generative classifier can be turned into a discriminative one by applying Bayes' rule, but the reverse is not generally possible. Knowing P of W given D does not tell you how data are generated. Graphically, discriminative models draw an arrow directly from D to W. Generative models draw arrows from W to D, with W also receiving a prior. Both can achieve low test error, but they make different structural commitments. Generative models must explain all variation in pixels or features, including background clutter that may be irrelevant to the label. Discriminative models may ignore those variations if they do not help prediction. Section 3, Example 1, Regression. Regression arises whenever the world variable W is continuous, depth at a pixel, head pose angle, room illumination, or tumor volume from scans. Each training example is a pair, feature vector X and scalar target Y. In vision, X might be patch intensities, SIFT descriptors, or the output of a convolutional layer. The discriminative formulation posits a parametric function y hat equals W transpose X plus B and chooses parameters to minimize the sum of squared residuals on training data. Geometrically, we seek the line or hyperplane that best fits the scatter of points. The squared law solution has a closed form in the linear case. W hat equals the inverse of X transpose X times X transpose Y. When features are high-dimensional, ridge regression adds a penalty lambda times the norm of W to prevent overfitting. This is the same as a Gaussian prior in a Bayesian linear model, foreshadowing our generative view. Nonlinear discriminative regression uses kernel methods or neural networks. The function class grows richer, but the principle remains: model Y as a direct function of X without specifying P of X. At test time, a new feature X star maps to a point prediction Y hat on the line. Unless we add heteroscedastic heads or bootstrap ensembles, the discriminative point estimate carries no calibrated uncertainty. That limitation matters in safety-critical vision, medical measurement, autonomous driving. Depth and scientific instrumentation often need confidence intervals, not just a single number. Discriminative regression nonetheless dominates large-scale benchmarks because it is simple to train end-to-end and scales to millions of parameters. The generative approach to regression begins one level higher in the probability hierarchy. Instead of modeling Y given X directly, we posit a joint distribution over both variables. The simplest continuous choice is a bivariate Gaussian with mean vector mu and covariance matrix sigma. Maximum likelihood on training data estimates those moments. Mu hat is the sample mean vector, sigma hat is the sample covariance. Once the joint is fit, prediction uses the conditional distribution P of Y given X, which is itself Gaussian with closed-form mean invariance. The conditional mean E of Y given X is an affine function of X, mu Y plus sigma X Y divided by sigma XX, times X minus mu X. That conditional mean is exactly the least squares regression line when the joint is Gaussian. The conditional variance sigma Y given X equals sigma YY minus sigma YX squared over sigma XX. This quantifies how tightly Y clusters around the line at each X. Wide conditional variance means high predictive uncertainty, narrow variance means confident predictions. This uncertainty comes for free from the generative specification. A deeper generative regression story introduces latent structure. We might model y equals f of x plus epsilon with epsilon Gaussian, or place a prior on W in linear regression. Heteroscedastic models let noise variance depend on x, useful when sensor noise grows in dark image regions. Mixture density networks output parameters of a Gaussian mixture for each x, capturing multimodal targets such as depth ambiguities and reflections. The unifying theme: specify how data are generated, then derive conditionals for prediction. Side-by-side comparison for regression. Discriminative, 1 step, optimize loss, get y hat. Generative, 2 steps, fit joint then condition. When the joint is Gaussian, the point predictions coincide. When the joint is misspecified, the discriminative model may still win on squared error because it is not forced to explain x. When calibrated uncertainty matters, rejecting uncertain depth estimates, gating downstream decisions, the generative path pays off. Section 4, Example 2, Binary Classification. Here the world variable W is discrete, y in 0, 1. Think background versus foreground pixel, face versus non-face, diseased versus healthy tissue. Logistic regression is the canonical discriminative classifier. It parameterizes P of y equals 1 given x as the sigmoid of a linear score W transpose x plus b. The sigmoid squashes the real line into 0, 1, guaranteeing a valid probability. Training maximizes the conditional log likelihood, equivalent to minimizing cross-entropy loss. The decision boundary is the set of x where P of y equals 1 given x is 1/2, equivalently where W transpose x plus b equals 0. For logistic regression with linear score functions, this boundary is a straight line in 2 dimensions or a hyperplane in higher dimensions. Cross-entropy loss heavily penalizes confident wrong predictions, which drives the boundary into the gap between classes. Convolutional neural networks with a softmax head generalize this idea. The network is a nonlinear feature extractor followed by logistic regression in embedding space. Support vector machines are another discriminative family. Instead of modeling probabilities, they find the maximum margin hyperplane separating classes. Kernel SVMs implicitly map features to infinite dimensional spaces while keeping optimization tractable. Modern deep classifiers replace handcrafted features with learned representations, but the discriminative contract is unchanged. Learn P of y given x or a scoring function S of y and x without modeling P of x given y. This focus yields state-of-the-art accuracy on ImageNet scale datasets. Generative classification specifies a class conditional density P of x given y and a class prior P of y. On the screen, blue and red ellipses are Gaussian fits to each class. Bayes' rule combines them. P of y given x is proportional to P of x given y times P of y. The decision boundary occurs where posteriors for the two classes are equal. If both classes share the same covariance matrix, the boundary is linear. This is linear discriminate analysis, or LDA. Different covariances produce quadratic boundaries, quadratic discriminate analysis, or QDA. Naive Bayes pushes the generative factorization further. P of x given y equals the product over features of P of xj given y, treating features as conditionally independent given the class. In vision, features might be individual pixel colors or filter responses. The independence assumption is rarely true. Neighboring pixels are correlated, yet naive Bayes can work well for spam filtering, document classification, and crude color-based detectors. It trains quickly, needs few examples per class, and handles high-dimensional inputs gracefully. Generative classifiers offer capabilities discriminative models lack. Out-of-distribution detection. If P of x given y is low for every class, the input may not belong to any trained category, useful for rejecting adversarial or corrupted images. Semi-supervised learning. Unlabeled x help refine P of x through mixture models or EM. Class imbalance. Priors P of y directly shift the boundary without reweighting hacks. Interpretability. Inspecting class means and covariances reveals what features the model believes distinguish classes. Comparing classification paradigms in practice. Discriminative logistic regression and deep nets dominate large-scale image classification because modeling every pixel is wasteful when only the label matters. Generative LDA and naive Bayes shine with small labeled sets and low-dimensional features. Face recognition with Fisher faces is historically LDA on PCA features. Spam filters used naive Bayes for decades. The boundary shapes may look similar on screen, but the assumptions and failure modes differ profoundly. Section 5. Which type of model should we use? There is no universal winner. The Ng and Jordan analysis, familiar to many machine learning students, shows that generative models can converge faster in sample complexity when their assumptions are correct, because estimating p of x given y for each class is easier than estimating p of y given x directly. But when the generative assumptions are wrong, Gaussian classes that are actually multimodal, independence that fails, discriminative models asymptotically dominate because they are less misspecified for the task. Use generative models when data are scarce, labels are expensive, you have strong domain knowledge about how measurements form, you need to sample or impute missing pixels, or you must combine multiple uncertain sensors with explicit noise models. Classical examples include Kalman filtering for tracking, structure from motion with geometric likelihoods, and medical image reconstruction with physics-based forward models. Use discriminative models when large labeled datasets are available, only the final prediction matters, features are high-dimensional and spatially complex, or you need the last ounce of benchmark performance. Object detection, instance segmentation, and image captioning today rely overwhelmingly on discriminative deep architectures. Yet even these systems often embed generative ideas, autoencoder pre-training, diffusion priors for generation, and energy-based models for out-of-distribution scoring. A practical decision checklist. 1. How much labeled data do you have? 2. Do you need probabilistic outputs or just hard decisions? 3. Must the model explain sensor physics? 4. Will the deployment distribution differ from training? Generative scores help detect shift. 5. What are compute and latency constraints? Naive Bayes and mod backgrounds are fast, large nets are not. Answering these 5 questions usually points clearly toward one paradigm or a deliberate hybrid. Section 6. Applications. We now ground the theory in 2 classical vision pipelines. Skin detection asks, which pixels belong to human skin? Applications include face and hand tracking for human-computer interaction, content moderation, and priming face detectors in video conferencing. Skin color occupies a relatively compact region of color space, though lighting, ethnicity, and makeup introduce variation. The generative approach models skin pixel colors as a distribution, often a Gaussian in YCBCR or HSV, learned from labeled skin patches. Training collects thousands of skin-colored pixels from diverse faces and hands. We estimate the mean and covariance of color features. At test time, each pixel's color vector x is evaluated under the skin density. If p of x given skin exceeds a threshold tau, the pixel is labeled skin. The threshold trades precision for recall. A high threshold reduces false positives on wood and sand, a low threshold catches more skin under blue lighting. ROC curve analysis picks tau for the application's needs. Why YCBCR color space? Separating luminance Y from chrominance CB and CR makes skin detection more robust to shadows and highlights. Skin clusters in chrominance channels even when brightness varies. The generative Gaussian in two-dimensional chrominance is cheap to evaluate per pixel, millions of pixels per second on a CPU. Morphological post-processing cleans isolated false positives. Connected component analysis extracts hand and face blobs for downstream trackers. The discriminative alternative labels skin and non-skin pixels in training images and learns a classifier, logistic regression, a shallow net, or a random forest on color and texture features. It can learn irregular decision boundaries that Gaussians miss, exploiting spatial context if features include neighborhoods. But it cannot sample plausible skin colors, nor flag colors that are unlikely under any training distribution. Production systems often cascade, fast generative color filter, then a discriminative convnet on candidate regions for precision. Background subtraction segments moving foreground objects in video surveillance, traffic monitoring, and interactive installations. The world variable W per pixel is binary, background or foreground. The generative story models what static background pixels look like over time. The simplest model stores per pixel mean and variance of color, updated online as new frames arrive. A pixel whose color is improbable under the background model is flagged foreground. The mixture of Gaussian's extension, due to Stauffer and Grimson, maintains k Gaussian components per pixel to handle repetitive background motion, swaying trees, flickering displays, moving water. Each component has weight pi k, mean mu k, and variance sigma k squared. Incoming pixels match existing components or spawn new ones. Components with persistent support classify as background, transient high variance components capture foreground. This remains a generative likelihood test per pixel, executed millions of times per frame. Online update rules adapt to gradual lighting changes, sunrise, clouds, while preserving sensitivity to sudden foreground entry. Learning rate parameters control how fast background statistics drift. Post-processing with erosion and dilation removes salt and pepper noise. Blob tracking links foreground pixels into object hypotheses across frames. The entire pipeline is interpretable. You can visualize per pixel Gaussians and understand exactly why a pixel was marked foreground. Discriminative background subtraction trains a network to classify pixels as foreground or background using temporal stacks or optical flow as input. Deep methods excel on complex scenes with shadows and camouflage but require labeled video and GPU inference. MOG backgrounds run on embedded hardware at full frame rate. The lesson from both applications is complementary, not competitive. Generative models encode measurement physics and enable fast baselines. Discriminative models refine decisions when data and compute allow. Summary: computer vision is inference, recover world state W from observed data D. Every pipeline needs a world representation, a measurement model, and inference. Discriminative learning targets P of W given D or a direct function F of D, ideal for regression lines, logistic boundaries, and deep networks at scale. Generative learning models P of D given W and P of W, applying Bayes' rule essential for uncertainty, synthesis, outlier rejection, and physical interpretability. Regression and classification showed that both paradigms can yield similar predictions yet encode different assumptions and capabilities. Modern vision stacks both views. Variational autoencoders and diffusion models are generative, classifiers on their latents are discriminative. Self-supervised learning trains generative or contrastive objectives, then fine-tunes discriminative heads for downstream tasks. Understanding when to model the world given data versus data given the world is the conceptual foundation beneath every paper and product in computer vision. Thank you for watching this detailed lecture on learning and inference in vision. Review the regression and classification plots to internalize how boundaries arise from different assumptions. Experiment with the toy datasets in the scene source code. When you read your next vision paper, ask, is this model discriminative or generative? What distribution are they actually fitting? That single question will clarify architecture choices, loss functions, and failure modes. Good luck with your projects.